Hey class, on to part two of the brain, and we're looking at the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is, you could argue, the most advanced portion of the brain, which means that our 15 minutes of discussing it today is just really not doing it justice. There's plenty more that can be learned. We're just going to hit some of the most basic structures and functions. And revisiting this image from before, this darkened region, all of this is the cerebrum, the largest region of the brain, and it's made of two cerebral hemispheres. So one on a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and they're divided by the longitudinal fissure. Remember earlier we talked about the dura mater and how it makes folds like the falx cerebri that goes down the midline of the brain. So when we say the cerebral hemispheres are divided by the longitudinal fissure, inside that fissure is the falx cerebri. These two hemispheres, anatomically, they look the same. There are some functional differences um, that we'll mention briefly later on. But one thing that you may have heard before is that the hemispheres operate contralaterally, which means the information is crossing over. So like you receive sensory information from and send motor commands to the opposite side of the body. And we don't really know why that is and if there's any significance to that. Much of what we'll talk about is looking at the cerebral lobes. So many of these lobes of the brain match the names of the cranial bones. So you have a frontal lobe, parietal lobes, occipital lobe, and temporal lobes. And then there's also this insula, or you'll hear it as called as the insular lobe, which is like the fifth type of lobe of the brain. And previously, in our intro to the nervous system, we talked about gray matter and white matter. Gray matter in the brain includes the cerebral cortex, the outer portion of the cerebrum, and there are basal nuclei. Remember, this term nuclei in this case we're saying is a bundle of gray matter, which is just cell bodies, a bundle of cell bodies embedded elsewhere in the brain. So not in the cerebral cortex, but a little island of gray matter. We call them basal nuclei. And if you look at the brain, really the most noticeable thing right away is the gyri and the sulci. So those are these grooves and fissures on the brain. But then there are even bigger fissures that we call fissures. And altogether, these serve really the same purpose. You're trying to increase the cortical surface area because you want to fit more synapses between neurons in there. And as it says, it's like a crumpled piece of paper. So if you have a piece of paper that you crumple up small, you've made all of these folds and ridges in the paper and you can fit it into a much smaller space. Here's some of the basic anatomy, just looking at the fissure. You've got some of the meninges still showing. You have cerebellum and portions of the brainstem that we'll talk about later. But you can also see the lobes. We start to see the lobes being named on these diagrams. And as we look at the lobes, this table just captures some of the most basic overarching functions of each lobe. And for some lobes, we'll talk about them in more detail, and others we won't really get into much more detail than this. But for starters, what you should learn is that the frontal lobe contains a specific region called the primary motor cortex. And as the name implies, this is the primary place in your brain that when you decide to move muscle, which means we're talking skeletal muscle, when you decide to move it, this is where the command originates. In the frontal lobe, a specific part called the primary motor cortex. The parietal lobes have a primary sensory cortex, really close to the motor cortex. It's right next door. This primary sensory cortex, it processes a lot of sensory information, but with a few exceptions like vision and hearing and smell. So when we're talking about touch and specific things that are similar to touch like pressure and vibration, pain, temperature are all processed here, and also taste. So if you're trying to remember what lobe processes certain sensory receptor signals, chances are it's the parietal lobe. But occipital lobe has a visual cortex where we process visual stimuli. So it's a pretty big lobe. big portion of what it does is just processing visual information. The temporal lobe, which is, right about here, it will not surprise you to know that it processes auditory information. And if you kind of send your pinkies out a little bit more towards the front, you could reach your nose to remind yourself that it also processes olfactory stimuli for the sense of smell. All of these lobes have what are known as association areas, where they're integrating and processing data. They're also kind of helping plan out motor activities. But we'll talk about those in a moment. We'll have some examples of those. But in short, it's kind of like checking in with other parts of the brain to make new associations, to figure out what the brain should do with this information it's gained. And don't forget about the insula, or you can call it the insular lobe. It's kind of deep underneath this big sulcus called the lateral sulcus on the side of the brain. We'll see more on that in a minute. So here is a color-coded map that's showing some of these lobes and structures. For example, when we talked about the frontal lobe, all of this is frontal lobe, but specifically we mentioned the primary motor cortex. So that's here. That's where your conscious control of skeletal muscle originates. And this ridge, this is one long continuous ridge. It has a name, the precentral gyrus. Precentral refers to the fact that there's a structure here called the central sulcus. Not a huge fissure, it's just one of these many sulci, but it happens to run right down the center of the brain. So it's called the central sulcus. So pre, in front of, before the central sulcus, is the precentral gyrus, a ridge in front of the central sulcus. So that's the structure. And what it does, what its function is it's the primary motor cortex. Then, behind or after the central sulcus is another gyrus, the postcentral gyrus. After the central sulcus is a gyrus. This is the primary sensory cortex. That's the one that processes touch, pain, temperature, vibration, pressure, and so on. You'll also see these association areas labeled, an association area here, there's one here, there's one here, and here. So we'll talk about those again in a second. And then you can see the other lobes here. Like this is really a great picture to see how the insular lobe is tucked away, kind of hidden inside of the brain. And we can see one thing it has is the gustatory cortex to help process the sense of taste. Now, if we read below, we'll see a note that each of the regions of the cortex have a nearby association area. And so we said that, what do these do? Well, they're not receiving sensory information directly or directly generating motor commands. They are making associations. They're trying to interpret things, interpret sensory input coming from elsewhere in the cerebral cortex, because the parts of the brain are in constant communication. So they're going to use that information to kind of create an understanding of your world. We can look at an example of that in a moment, but let's talk frontal lobe. We already mentioned the primary motor cortex, where it's found, and what it does. In this case, an association area would be like using memories, right, stored somewhere else, but making an association between these memories and these movements. So helping with learned movement patterns, help coordinate your behavior. So note that when we have an association area, we're accessing different information from a different part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, that's a region at the very front of the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex. Here's where you've got intellect, reasoning, judgment, concern for others, empathy, personality traits, management of your emotions, the ability to interpret events, predict the future. Not literally, but to, use what you know about the world to try to understand what will happen in the future. And so this region can be a source of anxiety since you are able to understand the world and predict the future. And this region of the brain is what was targeted during lobotomies. And so, if you don't know anything about the pretty sordid history of lobotomies in the United States, definitely worth a look. Pretty sad, awful time with even people like, JFK is not someone from my lifetime, but, it doesn't seem like ancient history by any stretch. And his sister was one of the last American citizens to be lobotomized. And depending on which books you read, it was for something as simple as being a very outspoken female at a time where men in power didn't appreciate that. So it's tough reading, but it's worth a look. The prefrontal cortex develops later in life and is impacted by your social environment. So, when you tell teenagers to make good choices, they may not be able to. They haven't fully developed their prefrontal cortex. And finally, this area is linked to the emotions, which we'll mention later is called the limbic system. The last thing the frontal lobe is good for, besides initiating these voluntary skeletal muscle controls and handling all of this fancy stuff, is that there are a language area called Broca's area where you produce speech. Another area you will hear about or encounter at some point is Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe where you comprehend speech. So you really need both of these intact to have these meaningful communication through verbal communication. So parietal lobe, and most of these lobes will be much shorter. Parietal lobe has your primary sensory cortex. We already talked about where that's found and what it does. And like all these lobes, there's an association area. Like if you process the sense of touch, that's okay, but you really need to access other parts of your brain to comprehend based on that touch. What size is this? What is its form or its texture or its weight or whatever? All of these things you're accessing different reference points in your brain to make these associations. The temporal lobe, we mentioned both its ability to process auditory and olfactory information. So one thing an association area might do is take those sounds that are processed and turn them into context. So participating with the Broca's and Wernicke's area are other parts of the temporal lobe that are trying to help us understand what we hear. That olfactory lobe is pretty deep, the olfactory cortex rather, is pretty deep in the temporal lobe, taking input in from the olfactory nerves, and it's tightly connected to that limbic system we mentioned before that is responsible for emotions and also memories. So some people have very evocative connections between certain smells and certain feelings or memories. I've never quite felt that way, but it's a thing. The occipital lobe has the visual cortex to process information from the retina, and its association area would interpret that data and again just put it into context. So like if you see a certain pattern on a shirt, that's okay. But if you realize it's the album cover from some emo band from back in your college days, and you're like, about that band? That's crazy. And then you get all your memories of the tattooing and the partying and the rocking. Yeah, that's making those associations. A few more things about the cerebrum. There is some specialization across the hemispheres, as we mentioned. So if you hear about people saying left-brained or right-brained, there appears to be some truth to that, with the left hemisphere being better at things like speech, language, and math, and the right hemisphere processing things like touch and spatial visualization. And of course, there's lots more that could be said about that, but we're just going to very quickly peek at this concept of hemispheric specialization. One of the other things we want to acknowledge is that there's not just all this gray matter in the brain, in the cerebrum of the brain. There's also white matter, which means there are axons, typically myelinated axons. This is where the information is zooming back and forth between these cell bodies and these synapses. And there are different names for this white matter in the brain. So, for example, you have association fibers, which are intrahemispheric. So they're inside of one hemisphere. They interconnect different cortical areas within a hemisphere. We call them association fibers. If you want to go to the other hemisphere to be interhemispheric, we call those commissural fibers. The classic example is the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is this kind of curled ridge or line here, and that's the main linkage between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Remember, the hemispheres can't talk. All right here is that big chunk of dura mater called the falx cerebri. So if the hemispheres want to talk, they have to talk through this. In this image, the scalpel has sliced through the corpus callosum. Otherwise, it would still be attached to the other side of the brain. And last, there are projection fibers. As the name projection would kind of suggest, these are projecting out further away than these other examples. So we're talking about going down to other regions of the brain, like the midbrain or the pons, cerebellum, or down to the spinal cord. If you notice, these are kind of in alphabetical order. The A is what you might want to think of first, because that's intrahemispheric. Those are short distances. And then you go to the C, and by the way, corpus callosum also starts with C's. So these C's are going a little bit further between the hemispheres, and when you get to P, now you're projecting out very far away from one part of the brain to another, or out of the brain altogether. And don't forget those basal nuclei, gray matter islands embedded in the central white matter. So their functions are subconscious control of skeletal muscle tone. That's meaning basically that your skeletal muscle is kind of always primed to be ready to fire, and the basal nuclei assist with that. They also help with coordinating these learned movement patterns and processing and integrating a bunch of stuff from the cerebral cortex. One of the examples of this that kind of takes into account some of that is like if you drop a pencil on the floor and you bend down to pick it up, like you've done it a million times, but that's a pretty tricky process to coordinate, the balance of weight as it shifts between your legs and as your center of gravity kind of tilts forward as your hand reaches out and you have to be aware of its movement through space. Like that's a lot of data coming in and going out, and the basal nuclei help coordinate that and smooth it out. So that's the cerebrum. That's kind of the biggest, busiest part of the brain. We quickly move through the rest of the brain here in the following video lectures. But for now, I'll say goodbye.